It is time to get going. If you'll bow with me in prayer. Our great Father in heaven, we are thankful to you for the day, for the time of worship and the time of study that we have together. We're thankful for this congregation that has such a love for your word and a love for you and a love for your kingdom. And Lord, we ask that we will, as your people, always be living for the kingdom, the responsibilities we have as being a part of that, but also the joy and the blessing that comes with belonging to you. Lord, we look forward to leaving this earth at some point and being with you. And Lord, that just it thrills our soul to know that is our future, that is our hope. That is our expectation as long as we will belong to you and trust in your grace. We love you, God. We thank you for the instructions we have in the Bible that not only show us the things that you would have us to do and not do, but also reveal your character and help us to remember, Lord, that the more we know, the more we study, the more we learn, the better we'll be able to understand your expectation and how we can bring honor to you. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right, we are in Exodus chapter 24. If you want to open up to there, Exodus chapter 24. And we've got to cover from chapter 24 a good long ways, all the way through 31. So most of this is going to be the instructions on the building of the tabernacle and the tabernacle furniture, and making sure that we kind of have a basic understanding of those things. I do find it interesting in the context. What chapter was it that they were given the Ten Commandments? Okay, 20. We're not very far removed from the Ten Commandments, right? Like God gives them verbally these 10 commandments in their hearing, and then God calls Moses up on the mountain, and he is sending, essentially, we kind of have a little bit of a back and forth going on with Moses going up and coming down. But Moses is pretty quickly, at least in the way the story reads, given the instructions for the tabernacle. And I don't think that's on accident. We've got some basic laws given, and then here's how we're going to start doing our worship. Here's how we're going to start approaching God. Here's how we're going to build that relationship with God. Because that is of utmost importance to God. The whole point of what God has been doing since Genesis chapter 3 is trying to restore the relationship that he has with his people, right? That's what was promised in Genesis chapter 3. That's why Abraham is called. That's why you've got the story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. You've got God going with his people down to Egypt. You have God rescuing his people from Egypt. But just over and over again, what we have is relationship language. And God is establishing himself, introducing himself to a people. He has established his worthiness, right? And the rescue and the displays of power. And now he is helping them to know how they are going to proceed in their worship. And what you see in the way that the tabernacle is built, you see this, and we talked about this some on Wednesday, you see this separation between the people and God, right? But what you also see is a kind of a phased introduction of growing closer to God. And so you have a little bit of both in the way that this is understood. But it is pretty interesting to see the way God commands them to build the tabernacle and the furniture and such. You have this sort of, the closer you get to God, the better it gets. Did y'all get that sense as you read through all of this? And so there is more richness and more lavishness and more splendor the closer you get to God's presence. And that's one of the things I want us to emphasize as we look through the way all of this works. So that brings us to Exodus chapter 24. You've got the story of them going up and eating and drinking with God. That ends there in verse 11. And then verse 12, God says to Moses, come up on the mountain. I'll give you the stone tablets and other laws for their instruction. Moses and his assistant Joshua, I find it interesting that that's the way Joshua is labeled here. He's Moses' assistant. But they go up on the mountain. My suspicion is, although it's never quite explained, as far as I know, Joshua doesn't go all the way up on the mountain. Like Joshua is kind of this in between. My guess is he is keeping an eye on making sure the people stay back, but he's also available to Moses. He's kind of the man in the front office. You know, he's the one making sure that things are working. But Moses comes up, and it says, Moses, verse 15, Moses went up on the mountain. The cloud covered it. The glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. On the seventh day, he called Moses from the cloud. The appearance of the Lord's glory to the Israelites was like a consuming fire on the mountaintop. Moses entered the cloud as he went up the mountain, and he remained on the mountain 40 days and nights. So again, imagine this story. You're an Israelite standing down at the foot of the mountain. You're on the outside of the boundary stones, right? You don't want to cross the boundary stones. What happens if you do that? You die. All right. So you're on the other side of the boundary stone. You're looking up on the mountain, and you see, you've felt the trembling. You've heard the horns blowing. You see the fire on top of the mountain. Smoke is everywhere. You see the glory of the Lord on top of the mountain, which I'm guessing oftentimes that's thought of like the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire. That is what is up on the mountain because it represents the Lord's presence. And so you've got that up on top of the mountain, and Moses and Joshua are there on the other side of the boundary stones, up the mountain a little bit, waiting. And they wait for 6 days. Now, this is a pretty stubborn and impatient people. I don't know if you've gotten that impression of them so far, right? I mean, you're probably standing there, you're going about your day-to-day life. You've got to go, tend the tent because one of the poles fell down, or, whatever your daily life is like, sitting there on the outside of the mountain, and you're like, what are they waiting for? Like, why are they still standing there? Day 4, day 5, it seems like nothing's happening. All you know is that this mountain seems to be falling apart, and then all of a sudden, Moses heads on up in. Okay? I'm doing this because I think it's important to set the stage for Wednesday's class when we get to the golden altar story. Okay? You're an impatient Jew who's scared to death of what is happening, but you don't understand really all that what is happening. And Moses is waiting, and then Moses goes up, not just into the fog or the smoke, but what do they see on the mountain? Fire. Moses has walked into the fire. Okay? And whether that he walked into the cloud and then they experienced the fire, but Moses is up on a mountain that is lit up on fire. Generally speaking, when somebody walks into the fire, what do you expect to happen? Yeah, barbecue, right? That's not going to be good, right? And so here you've got these Israelites that are waiting on Moses for 46 days. Okay, 6 days he's waiting for God to call him in. For 40 days he's up in the fire. What do you assume's happened? He's gone. Okay? I say that because I think it's important to have that stage set. I think it's important to understand why the Israelites could so easily be discouraged and why they might even so easily be willing to disobey what they know is the law of God. Right? Didn't God speak the laws to them? 46 plus days later, they're building an altar and an idol for that altar. They think God killed their leader. That would be my assumption. Okay, they think this God has turned on them maybe. So they're turning back to some other God. Now again, they call it, I'm getting into Wednesday night lesson, but they call it the God who brought us out of Egypt. But you got to remember to understand the way that they understood deities and the way that they understood all that worked. And we'll get into some of that on Wednesday night. And I want you to think about that between now and Wednesday night. But while Moses is up inside the fire, in some form or fashion, we don't know exactly what that would have been like, God gives him laws. And the first laws that God gives him up in the fire, up while he's caught up on the mountain, is the plans that he lays out for the tabernacle, okay? Somebody, if you don't mind, read chapter 25, verse 2 down through verse 9, 2 through 9. Okay, so God gives them a very specific plan of what he wants them to build. And there are, again, exact measurements of exactly where the rods are supposed to be placed, how it's supposed to be embellished in some way, if at all. And God gives them, placement of where the furniture is going to go, exactly what the tent's supposed to look like, what the tent curtains are supposed to be made of, what the tent curtain poles and hoops are supposed to be made of. Like every detail is included. My suspicion is even the details that aren't included are probably actually included. They're just not written down for us. But God gets very specific in the way that he wants them to build this tabernacle. Okay, and we won't have time because we got to go all the way through chapter 31 to dig into very specific details of all of that. I have not been using PowerPoint this quarter, but I do at least want to put up some pictures, artist renderings of what this might have looked like. So here's one artist rendering of essentially the layout of the way the tabernacle would have been. You've got this outer courtyard that is surrounded by essentially a curtain. That would have been some sort of separation between the camp of Israel and the actual tabernacle courtyard and tabernacle itself. And then there are some pieces of furniture that are there in the tabernacle courtyard, and then some pieces of the furniture are in the tabernacle itself. It looks like this was made out of toys, which even makes it more fun. Somebody made this out of toys. But we've got this idea of a tabernacle, and as far as the scope and measurements and things like that, I think it's useful to see this. I've made the point before that the entire tabernacle would have easily have fit inside this assembly room. Actually, if I'm remembering correctly, it would fit inside our foyer. The tabernacle, not height-wise, but width and length-wise, would fit inside our foyer. It's not a large structure, the tabernacle itself. And again, you start to wonder why. Well, again, it was supposed to be mobile, right? I did look up exactly how much this tabernacle, the way it's described, would have weighed. And you start adding up how much the different pieces and what metals it was made out of and the wood and all of that. You're looking at, I think it was somewhere around 6 tons. This entire thing, by the time you add it all together, pack it all up and put it on poles and carts and everything else. But, all the furniture had to be carried by people. And then you've got all of the tents and things like that I would imagine maybe they were carried by people, but you've got all of this that has to be moved every time the camp moves. So could you imagine if he made it 3 times as big? Like that becomes very unwieldy, right? Like that gets very difficult. So you've got a small structure. Secondly, God does not dwell in tents made with hands. Isn't that what we're told over in the New Testament? This isn't really God's dwelling place. This is not a palace made for God. It is simply a meeting place for God with his people. And so that, again, it has a limited use, even in that sense. But I do think as a kid, I grew up thinking the tabernacle would have been huge and the temple even bigger, and like they would have been these massive structures because they belong to God. Of course they're majestic and amazing, but they're not really. Like they're pretty simple as far as things go. And so that kind of helps us to understand some of that. You've got the different pieces of furniture that are represented here, and we'll talk about these more specifically, but here you've got the altar. The altar would have just been a square box with a grate on top where all the ashes could fall beneath, but that's where you would place your animals and your fire, and that's where you would be able to make your sacrifices. You have the laver or laver or water basin that would have been used for ceremonial cleansing. That would have been an important part of what they did. Inside the tabernacle, you've got the candelabra or the menorah with the 6 lights on it, and so you've got that there. They made it humongous. You've got the table of showbread that they would have had their 12 loaves of bread on. That would have represented the 12 tribes. You've got inside here the altar of incense. I've seen that pictured so many different ways, but the altar of incense that would have burned continually, that had its special incense, right? Like the incense itself was not to be mimicked. It was not to be used for any other purposes. It was something that was holy to the Lord. And then inside the actual Holy of Holies, you've got the Ark of the Covenant, which we'll talk about more in just a moment. But I say all that to say that's not a lot, right? That's not a lot of pieces. They're essentially 5-6 pieces of furniture. That's it. I mean, for worshiping the creator of the heavens and the earth, the creator of the entire universe, that's not a lot of expectation there. And I've always been fascinated by God's humility, which is what I think a lot of what the tabernacle displays for us. God's humility. Even when we finally do get a temple, why do we get a temple? David wanted to build the temple. David was the one who said, God, a tent is not good enough for you. Did God say a tent wasn't good enough for him? Not at all. And so even then, even when God finally does get a brick and mortar building, so to speak, it's not because God felt like he deserved it. And you look at that kind of character in the deliverance of this law, that reveals a lot about the God we serve. God is not about himself. God is about other things. It's one of the reasons I've always been it always grates on me a little bit when you have conversations with people about, well, why were we created in the first place? And people say we were created because God needed or wanted to be praised. Really? I know there are passages about us praising the Lord and the appropriateness of that. I'm not disagreeing with any of those passages, but I can't fathom that a God who would associate himself with a tent and 5 pieces of furniture, 6 pieces of furniture, is that concerned about whether he gets enough praise or not. I think God's concerned with the effect that praising him has on us, right? And I think God is concerned with the appropriateness of our relationship with him. But I don't know that God did all that he did for us because he just wanted somebody else to say thank you, right? Like that doesn't seem to fit with the humility of God as it is displayed here. So maybe I'm making too much of that. I've been accused of worse, but it's that I think is pretty remarkable here when you get into talking about the tabernacle. There's also all of the little specific descriptive things that were created in order for the worship to take place. One being the Ark of the Covenant itself. This is the only picture I found of the Ark that I think actually has the poles placed correctly. Most of the pictures of the Ark places the poles on the long sides because that's the way we would do it. It doesn't really specify in the text, but we've talked about this before, that the idea of the ark mimics very closely the ancient Near East ideas of a king's litter, right? The idea of where you would put a king up on a platform and he would have servants that would be carrying the king into battle or carrying the king down the streets of, in a parade, in a processional, that sort of thing. Those would have been much more like this idea of the poles on the short side, because you're creating essentially a mobile throne for God. I also find that fitting because when you look at passages like the beginning of the book of Ezekiel, what do you find God revealed as doing? He's riding around on his mobile throne. Now, it's much more impressive, wheel within a wheel. You got the different spirits that are the wheels that are turning it this way and that. It's a fascinating description of the throne of God, but it is a throne of God that moves with his people. That's the description. And so the idea of God saying, I will place my feet, this will be my footstool, this is the mercy seat, all of those ideas of this is where God's presence really is among his people as it's attached to this ark. It seems that the ark, the place where God sits, is the place where the law is. It is the place where essentially they carry this before the people. How many times do you read of them carrying this into battle? That's how they lost it, actually, at one point. But even going into their promised land and carrying it before the people across the Jordan River, it's the idea of we are carrying our king on his litter everywhere we go, right? And so I encourage you to kind of rethink the way we think about the Ark of the Covenant a little bit. It's not merely a container box, a storage container for the Ten Commandment tablets, right? It's more than that. That's also why you've got the angels. I love the way it describes the cherubim. The cherubim, verse 20, it's chapter 25, verse 20. The cherubim are to have wings spread out above, covering the mercy seat with their wings, and are to face one another. The faces of the cherubim should be toward the mercy seat. And so this idea of the angels looking down, what does that look like? This. What does it look like? Bowing. Okay, the idea of what's being presented there is that the angels are bowing to the one in the middle, right? The other idea you have is with them spreading their wings out above, is it's creating a shade. What do you often think of when you think of kings on their litter? Right? They got the shade above them. You got the servant that's carrying the palm branches above the litter to make sure that the sun doesn't get on the king. Right? I mean, all these ideas that we're familiar with are represented here in the description of the ark. It's not a container box. It is where God sits among his people. Okay? It is in a sense a throne in the midst of the people. Okay, and I love that. I love that's what we have here. But then that makes it even more significant that that's where the Ten Commandments are stored. Beneath the Lord are the laws he has created for his people. That idea is remarkable. Okay, and so you can disagree with all of that if you want to, and go back to it is a very pretty storage container if you want to. But I think there's more to it than that. I think that's what's being described here. And I think that's the reason it is the first thing described. It is the most important piece of furniture that is made for worship. Moves on to talk about the table in chapter 25, which is the table of showbread, where they actually had the loaves, the 12 loaves for the people. And that, there's other laws that are given later regarding how they were to treat the loaves and how often they were to bake the loaves and who was to eat the loaves and those sorts of things. But you've got, again, this gold table made of acacia wood. Again, anybody thought about why acacia wood? First of all, my mother-in-law, there was a place in Orlando, I think it might still be there, called the Holy Land Experience. Is that still there? It's over in Orlando. It was really cool when it was first made, and we went back like 10 years later, and it became the gaudiest place you've ever seen in your life. Like, it's crazy looking. But there, one of the things they have in their shops is they sell plants from the Holy Land. And so they sold acacia plants. Okay, acacia is very fast growing. It will grow bush-like. It almost grows like bamboo, honestly. It's long, leggy branches, but it grows very quickly. It has this like puffball flower on it that smells just like strawberry candy. It is a beautiful plant. Super long thorns on it. More than likely, that's what Jesus' crown of thorns was made out of, because it grows like a weed over there in the wilderness. Well, essentially, God said, chop down all of these overgrown weeds and make these pieces of furniture with it, and then overlay them with gold. But again, talk about God's humility. God didn't say they had to go all the way to Lebanon and chop down some cedars of Lebanon in order to mill the wood so that it would be perfectly, it has to be long grain and no knots. Like that. That's not God's expectations. God isn't making them jump through enormous hoops in order to build his tabernacle and the furniture. Go use the weed plant that grows out there in the wilderness. Just chop down some of the bigger ones and make the furniture out of that. Right? And again, I think there's some significance to if we are right that is likely what they made Jesus' crown of thorns out of. Jesus' crown of thorns is made out of the same stuff the furniture of the tabernacle was made out of. So just the holiness aspect of that. But here we've got this table of showbread made out of acacia wood, overlaid with gold, and that seems to be significant. Okay, the altar of incense, same thing, made out of acacia wood and overlaid with gold. And again, elsewhere in Scripture, we'll have all the rules about how the incense was to be handled and how often changed out and what the formula was for the incense that they made that only the priest could make, because nobody else was allowed to use that particular smell in their homes, because that would make it less holy. The menorah was not made out of acacia wood. It was pure gold, and it was made out of a talent of gold, and then stretched to make the shape, and then of course very much embellished with the different blossoms and buds and those sorts of things that were to light up on that. I've seen a bunch of different interpretations of the menorah. It's not really a menorah. Menorah actually has different number of lights on it and is associated with the Maccabean revolt and those sorts of things. But this menorah here with the different lights, and I've seen some actually, because of the way it is described here, the verse 35, for the 6 branches that extend from the lampstand, a bud must be under the first pair of the branches from it, a bud under the second pair of branches, a bud under the third pair of branches. Their buds and branches are to be made of one piece, all of it to be a single hammered piece of pure gold. The 7 lamps, set them up so that they illuminate the front of it. I've seen other descriptions of how all that would lay out, and not necessarily all side by side, but maybe branched in different ways and all of that. I don't know. Again, I don't think in pictures, so that makes it really hard for me to do anything other than just look at other artist renditions of some of this stuff. But that, again, you've got all of these gold things. Now, that seems to be one of the significant details in the early part of this description. All of the stuff that went in the tabernacle is made of what? Gold. Very, very good. Gold. All right. Then we get into this description of the tabernacle itself and all the curtains and what the curtains are supposed to be made out of and how big the curtains are supposed to be and where they're supposed to hang, and that's what chapter 26 is about. Okay? The main significance of that chapter is going to be the dividing curtain. The dividing curtain, what's it dividing? Okay, the holy place and the most holy place. So you've got 2/3 of the tabernacle, that is the holy place, and then the back 1/3 of the tabernacle is the most holy place. And so there's a very large, heavy curtain that is placed between those two to separate those two areas. And so that becomes very significant because that division has to be there. Then chapter 27 gets into the other pieces of furniture. You've got the altar of burnt offerings that sits outside in front of the tabernacle proper, and then you've got the courtyard and the lamps, the lampstand oil, not that, the laver that is also out there. And so those two pieces are on the outside. They're made of bronze, okay? Some versions will say copper. So you've got bronze out there. What's nicer, gold or bronze? Gold, obviously. And again, that's that significance that the closer you get to the presence of God, the nicer things are going to get. And it's just that way of treating God in a holy manner. Part of that is, I think, the experience. Part of that is to create that idea of, that would be a recognizable thing, that the closer you get to the presence of God, the more special things are, and how important that would be in trying to understand that. Then we've got this in chapter 28, this description of the priest and his garments, and there's all sorts of specific details about that, and exactly the way the high priest is supposed to be dressed. And then you've got the breastplate that he wears outside of his garment. You got the Urim and the Thummim, and we still don't have a clue what those are really, but they're somehow attached to his garment depending on what you think they look like. And so those become a part of the entire garment that he's supposed to wear. The turban he's supposed to have on the top of his head, and some of the significance of all that. What do you think is the main significance of the priestly garments?
It's different than all the rest of the people.
Yeah, that really seems to be the idea. He's wearing the regular priest garments beneath all of this, but he has all sorts of extra things he wears in order to signify that he is performing in a special role. He is going to be representing the people to God and representing God to the people. And so that becomes a really important part of this entire deal. He, along with the other priests, are going to be consecrated and made holy for their service to the Lord. And so here you've got some specific descriptions there of what they're supposed to do to purify themselves, what they're supposed to do in order to make sure that they are being the people that, or representing the people well from God's perspective, which means they need to do so in purity and holiness. And then they're also going to be among the people. They're going to be representing the people and interacting with the people and doing those sorts of things. Now we know in this part that Aaron and his family were specially chosen for that job, and that becomes a very significant part of Jewish history because of the way that they're supposed to be representing the people. We go to chapter 30, and we've got a little bit more description of some of the specific pieces of furniture. Chapter 30 talks about the incense altar itself, again made of acacia wood. It was burn incense pretty much all the time. They overlaid it with gold there in verse 5. And so they're supposed to place that in the altar or in the tabernacle outside the curtain but close to the ark. Okay, so it's not, that I believe that is accurate. I've actually seen pictures of it inside the most holy place, but again, people go a lot of different directions with some of this stuff. Atonement money, I want to look at that a little bit. Chapter 30, starting in verse 11. Lord spoke to Moses, when you take a census of the Israelites to register them, each of the people must pay a ransom for his life to the Lord as they are registered. Then no plague will come on them as they are registered. Everyone who's registered must pay a half shekel according to the sanctuary shekel, which is 20 gerahs to the shekel. This half shekel is a contribution to the Lord. Each man who is registered 20 years old or more must give this contribution to the Lord. The wealthy may not give more, and the poor may not give less than half a shekel when giving the contribution to atone for your lives. Take the atonement price from the Israelite and use it for the service of the tent of meeting. It will serve as a reminder for the Israelites before the Lord to atone for your lives. I find that interesting here that we've got this, essentially this fair tax. That's how we would call it in our country, right? Give everybody the same tax. But it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. It doesn't matter what your circumstances are. Everybody is to give the same. Everybody is to atone for their lives. Everybody is to essentially give tribute to the Lord for what the Lord has done. That's significant because it is very kingly. Okay, and what I mean by that is what a normal king would do. That is, it is God functioning in the role as the ruler of the people. And so this idea of I'm going to make you essentially give a tribute to the Lord for what the Lord has done for you is the idea of what a king would do if the king had protected his people. And so that I think sets up that expectation. When we get later in the story and they start asking for a king, what is the response of God? Do what? Yeah, he tells Samuel, you didn't reject me. They didn't reject you, they rejected me. Because God had set themselves up from this point on, not just to be their God, but to be their king. And this is one of the proofs of that God is acting as a king to the people. And so that should have been their understanding of things. Now, later on, obviously that's not. Keith, what did you say? Yeah. Well, I was going for what Nathan said of they rejected God as their king. And so that becomes an important piece of that also. Bronze basins described here in chapter 30. You got the incense and the anointing oil that is described and how they're supposed to do all that. We don't have time to get into all of that. But I do want to look at chapter 31 because I think there's an interesting piece here at the beginning of chapter 31. Somebody, if you will, read... Somebody who likes to read Hebrew names, so I'm just prefacing it with that because there are some of them in this reading. Somebody read verse 2. Honestly, just go ahead and read that whole section, 2 down through 11. Chapter 31, 2 through 11. Okay, so there's a couple of things that I find fascinating about this little section. One is this: God provides. right? God made sure that if he was going to give all of these specific instructions of exactly how he wanted things to look and how it was to be made, he made sure that there were people who were skilled enough to make that happen. Now, whether that means God was going to give them some specially imbued skills for the moment, they might have never swung a hammer before in their life, and all of a sudden now they find themselves so adept with hammers it's like having extensions of their arms. Maybe that's what it's talking about. It could be God saying, these are people with the skills, and I made sure that when they were born and as they grew up, they developed these skills, and they are more than capable of accomplishing the task that I've given you to do. That's also possible. The reason I say that is God had provided the materials. How? How did God provide the materials for them to get all this work done? Yeah. The Egyptians essentially pressed it into their arms and said, hey, take this with you. God provided all of that for a slave nation as they were leaving their captors and oppressors. God made sure they had all the gold, silver, bronze, and fabrics that they needed in order to accomplish this task. God is more than capable of providing before the need occurs if God wants to. And so that could be what he means here. Or it could mean they essentially, like Samson had the Spirit of God come on him and he did feats of strength, that these people had the Spirit of God come on them and all of a sudden they are expert craftsmen like the world has never seen before. I don't know which way we're supposed to understand this, but I think either one is possible. Davis? Maybe. I don't know that they were. But general skills that could attribute to their ability. Yeah, I mean, I would imagine most people in the world at this point had some sort of skill set that was, they didn't sit at computers all day long. They were agricultural, they built stuff, that sort of thing. So, I mean, everybody grows up with skills. Every single one of us in here has certain skills. So I would imagine. Yes, I don't know that as slaves they were doing, there's a big difference between rough carpentry and finished carpentry and then furniture making. Like those are three very different skills, even though you're using similar tools and similar materials. So I don't know that they would have had necessarily the special craftsmen who were good at fashioning gold as a poor slave nation. Like maybe some of them were in the specialty shops there in Egypt, even though Egyptians didn't have anything to do with Hebrews. So, and I'm sure they didn't have specialty shops for Hebrews. I don't know, but again, I'm not sure which one we're dealing with. It could be either way, but for whatever reason, this is provided. Secondly, I find it really interesting that not only does God provide some people with the skill to make the job happen, God provides Moses with the names of the people who could have the skills to make the job happen. How big is the nation at this point? Well over 1 million, right? 600,000 men, and then you add what would have likely been the amount of women and children of that, you've got well over 1 million people in this nation standing at the foot of this mountain. How easy is it going to be to find the best craftsmen in the crowd? Right? I mean, that is, so God provides the names and the family connections of exactly how he's going to find these people. He would have been able to come down to the foot of the mountain and send out messengers to find these particular people and have them back to him within the hour, right? Like that, God's providing the support Moses needs in order to get the job done. So, Keith? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I would imagine so. But again, it's one of those, you ever met a person who all of a sudden takes up a new hobby and you're like, how in the world are they able to do that? They've never done this before. I'm that way with people who are good at woodworking. 'Cause I'm Alan over there, it's just like, I'll just whip out my pocket knife and whittle you up whatever it is you want to see, and I'll have it done in about 20 minutes, blah, 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 And I'm like, how in the world? Like, how is that even possible to be able to do that kind of stuff? And it's one of there's my nephew's father-in-law lives out in Conway, Arkansas. He's a doctor, has a family practice. A couple of years ago, probably 5 or 6 years ago, he was like, I think I want to take up drawing. Never drawn anything in his life. He draws pencil portraits of people that you would have thought they were computer generated off of a photograph. He just decided he was going to take a few drawing classes, and he has an incredible knack for it. I don't know if this was something like that, that just God imbued them with special skills that they'd always had, they just never actually used because of their situation in Egypt. I don't know. What I do know is God provided the work, the skills. God provided the workers to Moses. God provided the materials that were needed to get the job done, right? It's amazing what God provides in all of this. And then the other piece of this is I would assume that it is now Moses' job to give them the instructions. Because it never says God provided them with blueprints of exactly what he wanted all of this to look like that fell out of heaven or just appeared on their dining room table one night when they went in for supper, right? Moses has the instructions. Now Moses has to sit down and work with them. And that's very typical of the way we see God function. And God says, this is what I want you to do, but God still expects us to do the work of making sure that it happens. And so that I find interesting in here also. He does remind them here about the Sabbath at the end of chapter 31. Tell the Israelites, you must observe my Sabbaths, for it's a sign between us. Here, work must be done for 6 days. On the seventh, there must be a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Anyone who does work on the Sabbath must be put to death. The Israelites must observe the Sabbath, celebrating it throughout all generations as a permanent covenant. It is a sign between me and the Israelites. For the Lord made the heavens and earth in 6 days, but on the seventh he rested. So again, we've got that because of the way things were created. That's why I want you to do this. Okay? That answer changes again when we get over to Deuteronomy. There's a different explanation. But we'll talk about that when we get there. And then last two verses, when he had finished speaking with Moses, he gave him the 2 tablets of the testimony, stone tablets inscribed by the finger of God, which again is just pretty amazing. Okay, now those are going to get broken pretty quick whenever we get to the next chapter on Wednesday night. But hopefully that will be. We'll get into it then and talk about it then. So thank you for your time. We'll finish there. Unless any other comments? Yep, Keith. Yeah. 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 And again, I think even with all of this, I don't know that the item itself is good enough for God as much as God declares it holy because of the way it will be used. And I think that becomes again, a revealing point of God's character. This isn't about whether something is good enough for him. This is about the relationship it is going to make happen because of how it will be used. The ark itself was not anything special. They carried the ark out with God not attached to it. It got captured, those kind of things. It wasn't the box that mattered. It was the presence of God that matters. It was how it was being used that matters. And that becomes an important piece of this. Aaron rod itself becomes an idol, those types of things. God did things with it, but when we misuse it, it becomes not holy anymore. And so anyway, we'll pick up there on Wednesday.